Hello, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm Sasha Mackler, and I lead the energy project here at the BPC. As many of you know, the BPC strives to combine the best facts with the most relevant politics in the service of robust policy design. This week is quite emblematic of this mission for the energy project, as today we have the premier energy data arm of the US government explaining their flagship analysis of the US energy sector. And tomorrow we have the leader of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, Senator Joe Manchin, visiting with us to discuss the politics of the possible with respect to climate change. That is also a public event, and I encourage you to register. The information can be found on our website. In recent years, the BPC has been a proud partner with the EIA in the release of their annual energy outlook. We are excited again to be doing it this year, although we must acknowledge that it's occurring in a slightly different way. The virtual format of this session is a result, of course, of the global pandemic. We're fortunate to be able to continue our work thanks to the wonders of modern technology, but we also know that large parts of our economy have been significantly impacted, including the energy sector. We are clearly in the midst of an energy transition. Technologies and businesses have experienced extraordinary changes in a short period of time. Some of these changes are structural, and others are driven by external forces like policy or other trends. To best understand the implications of this transition is really important, and this task is even harder in the midst of an abrupt economic shift created by the unpredictable health crisis that we find ourselves in. Just a year ago, as we were meeting to look at the AEO 2020, the US had dramatically increased its production of hydrocarbons, and the cost of renewable energy technologies had sharply declined, making wind and solar some of the cheapest sources of new energy. But then, as we all know, the year unfolded in unexpected ways. The 2020 energy outlook suggested we would continue to see strong margins and robust demand for oil and gas. But by the summer, US demand for transportation fuels had cut in half. Global electricity demand had dropped to Sunday levels. Planes were grounded, and we were all working from home. Life patterns and trade were fundamentally transformed. And now further changes are on the horizon. We have a new president with an aggressive climate change agenda that promises to alter the energy sector in fundamental ways. The EIA is the nation's most authoritative and independent source of data, forecasts, and analysis of the US energy market. The value of the AEO is not in its predictions of what will happen, but rather its projections of what could happen. And they take advantage of our current understanding of market and policy forces. In that spirit, we are thrilled to have the leadership of the EIA here today to roll out their latest work and to discuss with us the key implications. Today, we have Steve Nally, the newly named acting administrator, and Angelina LaRose, the assistant administrator for energy analysis. They'll walk us through the AEO 2021, and then we'll have a 20-minute discussion that'll be moderated by myself, and we'll take some questions from the audience. Let me just remind everyone to please submit questions using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. Let me introduce Steve and Angelina, and we'll jump into the conversation. Steve has a wealth of expertise in petroleum and natural gas markets and data operations. He started his career as petroleum data analyst in the private sector, and then 30 years ago, he joined the EIA to lead the natural gas survey team. He was appointed as the deputy administrator in 2018 before he assumed his current role. Angelina is the assistant administrator for energy analysis. She's had a 20-year career at EIA, the first 10 years in natural gas analysis, and then most recently as the director of the Office of Integrated and International Energy Analysis. In her current role, she directs the modeling program, which supports all of EIA's forecasts and projections. And with that, I'll turn it over to Steve to lead us through the latest AEO. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Sasha, and thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting this year's Annual Energy Outlook release event. And good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining us. The Annual Energy Outlook, or the AEO, is the culmination of the year-long efforts by many EIA energy professionals. And it really is my great pleasure today to have the opportunity to share some of the key takeaways from this year's AEO. Because the AEO covers so much ground across the reference case and side cases, there's simply not enough time to cover it all today. So what we have attempted to do in today's presentation is to address 3 areas that are of perennial interest to our stakeholder community. And we'll get to the specifics in just a few minutes. I also want to remind you that the full AEO document, which includes the graphs in today's presentation, as well as the full set of data tables, will be available for download on the EIA's website following today's presentation. And the recording of this presentation will be made available on both the Bipartisan Policy Center and the EIA's sites. As Sasha said, the AEO is one of EIA's flagship products and therefore provides a vital role in our mission as the nation's premier source of independent, impartial energy information. This is really a key point in that EIA's information helps inform energy policy discussions, such as the ones the Bipartisan Policy Center hosts. However, we never advocate for any particular policy. And it is important to keep in mind that the AEO does not predict what will happen in the long-term energy market, but rather it provides modeled projections of what may happen given certain assumptions and methodology. By varying those assumptions and methodologies, the AEO illustrates important factors in the future energy production and use in the United States. While it is important to predict, while it is impossible to predict the energy future, I believe that the EIA's analysis, forecasts, and projections provide context to the data trends and help inform a healthy national dialogue for energy-related issues. This year's AEO starting point comes in the midst of a demand-side market shock brought on by the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, global consumption of liquid fuels fell by almost 20% in the spring. And while liquid fuel consumption bounced back rather quickly, the annual average for 2020 is down by 9 million barrels per day. And we expect it to take 2 years to return to the 2019 consumption levels based upon our most recent short-term energy outlook. EIA will continue to address COVID-19 impacts in the STIO forecast, which is updated each month and now extends our forecast through the end of 2022, as well as through many of our other statistical and analytic products. Despite the near-term demand impacts brought on by COVID-19, long-term world energy demand is increasing. You may recall our most recent reference case projection for total world energy consumption, which comes from our international outlook, shows more than a 50% increase between now and 2050. That increase in demand for energy will create opportunities, synergies, and challenges for the United States and serves as a relevant backdrop to our discussion of U.S. energy markets. And before moving on to the highlights, I also want to point out that EIA published a report entitled Trends and Expectations Surrounding the Outlook for Energy Markets that discusses some of the considerations that we included in the AEO 2020 and will be included in our International Outlook 2021 later this year. It includes a discussion of the considerations contributing to the pace and level of economic recovery, both domestically and globally, and changes in the U.S. energy import-export balance, including petroleum, other liquids, natural gas, electric power, and coal trade. 3 broad themes emerged from our AEO 2021 analysis and model. First, the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on energy consumption behavior and economic activity will have a lasting impact on U.S. energy consumption and carbon dioxide emissions. In the high economic growth case, it takes 5 years to return to the 2019 energy consumption levels. And in the low economic growth case, it takes 30 years. Second, changes in the electric power sector are being driven by a variety of incentives for renewable power generation. Advances in technology are lowering the cost of renewable electricity, including the cost of installing solar PVs and the cost of energy storage and distribution centers to mitigate intermittent availability. All of these changes support robust competition with natural gas. The trajectory of natural gas prices has a significant role in the amount of electricity produced from renewables versus natural gas. However, other power generation sources struggle to maintain their market share in this competitive environment. Third, the United States produces record crude oil, natural gas plant liquids, and dry natural gas for the next 3 generations in the reference case and most of the side cases. In all cases, the U.S. remains a net exporter of dry natural gas, but it is not the case for petroleum products. In the reference case, the U.S. has a trade surplus in crude oil and petroleum products of up to 2.2 million barrels per day. And in the side cases, with lower cost U.S. resources and higher international oil prices, U.S. exports could expand 7 to 10 million barrels per day. However, the trade surplus disappears in cases of lower international oil prices and more expensive U.S. resources. Throughout these highlights, the international market looms large. Economic growth, technology investment decisions, and policy incentives, both domestically and internationally, will shape energy markets for the next 30 years. Again, if you or your organization prefer a different outcome, remember that the AEO is a projection, not a prediction. The contrasting the reference case baseline with the AEO side cases can help you evaluate what more or less needs to be done to achieve economic or policy goals. This slide provides a brief overview of our energy model assumptions in the AEO 2021 reference case in the 8 side cases. One of the most sensitive inputs is the real US GDP, because small changes in the economy can significantly affect energy consumption. The reference case assumes 2.1% GDP growth, while the high and low economic growth cases assume 2.6% and 1.6% respectively. World oil prices also have an effect on energy production and consumption in the United States. The reference case assumes Brent oil prices reach $95 per barrel in 2050, while the high and low oil price cases assume $173 and $48 per barrel. While the reference case assumes technology cost reductions continue to follow historic trends, the low renewable cost case accelerates the rate of cost decline, ending at almost 40% below the cost in the reference case by 2050. And with that, I'm pleased to hand the rest of the presentation over to Angelina LaRose, EIA's Assistant Administrator for Energy Analysis, under whose leadership the AEO 2021 was developed.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks again to the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting today's event. I wanted to carry on the thread of the different assumptions in the different cases as Steve just presented, and by showing this slide, which is another way of looking at it. This year's annual energy outlook includes 9 cases. Each of them incorporate the laws and regulations as of September 2020 and vary the technical and macro assumptions, which results in the differences as Steve just showed on the previous slide. None of these cases are anticipating potential policy changes or trying to incorporate a policy forecast. So as Steve just discussed, the COVID-19 pandemic certainly presented unique challenges and questions in the development of this year's AEO. Our analysis suggests that the pandemic will have a lasting impact on US energy consumption as well as on energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. As noted in this first highlight, long-term projections are always uncertain, and they just feel all the more uncertain this year. So I urge you all to view our projections in the context of looking across the various cases and trying to understand the various different assumptions that result in the differences between the projections. For example, as Steve mentioned, depending on our economic growth assumptions, the return to 2019 levels of US energy consumption could occur as quickly as 5 years or as long as 30 years. So I'm going to walk us through some of these details. So this slide is showing our GDP assumptions on the left across 3 of our cases. This is a reference case as well as our high and low macro case. On the right, we're seeing delivered energy consumption across sectors in those cases. The 2020 downturn in the US economy stems from a series of demand shocks, both direct and indirect, that have resulted in large part from curbing the spread of COVID-19. Delivered energy demand decreased to 90% of its 2019 levels in 2020. And this is a steeper decline than we saw in real GDP. Compared with the financial crisis of 2008, the COVID-19 related decline in total delivered energy demand is about 70% larger. Total delivered energy consumption in the reference case returns to its 2019 levels in 2029. Projections in the AO focus on key factors driving longer-term demand growth. So that's things like the growing economy and population, increasing use of renewables, increasing consumption of natural gas and electricity, and changing technology, behavior, and policy that affects energy efficiency in vehicles and use equipment and lighting. These factors extend beyond the uncertainty resulting from the pandemic response. The economic growth cases provide alternative assumptions that reflect uncertainty in future growth of the US economy. The economic growth cases also show the fastest and slowest rates of recovery to the 2019 levels of total delivered demand, hitting 2019 levels by 2024 in the high economic growth case and by 2050 in the low economic growth case. And again, this is compared to 2029 in the reference case. So what this slide is showing is US energy consumption by sector on the left graph and by fuel on the right. Looking across sectors in the reference case, we can see in the left-hand chart that the majority of US energy consumption growth comes from the industrial and electric power sectors. This is, in the industrial sector, this is because competitively priced hydrocarbon gas liquids and natural gas increase the need for those fuels for industrial manufacturing. And beginning late in this decade, long-run growth in the uses of electricity across all sectors contribute to the growth in the electric power sector consumption. The right-hand chart highlights the steady growth in renewable energy led by solar and wind and natural gas post-2035. I'm going to discuss this more later in the presentation. Consumption of energy for transportation is the most affected by the pandemic. Energy consumption in the transportation sector remains lower than its 2019 levels for the entire projection period. This is both because travel decreased in 2020, as well as assumed improvements in fuel economy offset projected travel growth. Responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, including mobility restrictions, limitation on non-essential travel, and increased working from home, greatly reduced long and short distance US travel demands in 2020 compared to 2019. In the reference case, air travel decreased by nearly 2/3 and returns to 2019 levels by 2025. Bus travel decreases by nearly half and returns to 2019 levels in 2031. And light duty vehicle travel returns to 2019 levels by 2024. So whereas the prior slide included all fuels, this slide focuses on petroleum and other liquids consumption, with consumption by sector on the left and by fuel type on the right. Here we see the transportation sector is the largest consumer of petroleum and other liquids throughout our projection. This really is not a surprise. What's kind of striking, though, in this slide is how little change occurs within sectors or fuels between 2020 and 2050. The increases we see in the first few years reflect just the initial recovery from the pandemic. The large majority of growth in consumption of petroleum and other liquids occurs only in the industrial sector and in the use of liquefied petroleum gas. So think feedstocks for plastics. So as we've seen thus far, petroleum is sticky, natural gas is increasing, and coal is declining. This has implications for emissions. So on this slide, you see reference case energy-related CO2 emissions by fuel on the left chart and across cases on the right. Changes in reference case energy-related carbon dioxide emissions reflect the shift in fuel consumption that we have seen in the previous slides. So post-2022, emissions are decreasing in the near term as a result of a transition away from more emissions-intensive coal and a rise in renewable energy. After 2035, emissions begin to trend upward, reflecting an overall increase in US energy usage as a result of increasing population and economic growth. This trend holds true across the cases, which you can see in the graph on the right. The high economic growth case has the largest increase in emissions, and the low economic growth case has the lowest. Reductions in both energy intensity, which energy intensity is energy consumption per GDP, as well as carbon intensity, which is CO2 per energy consumption, both dampen the effects of economic growth. So even in a high economic growth case, energy-related CO2 emissions remain lower than the 2007 peak of 6 billion metric tons through 2050. So moving on to our second theme that we wanted to highlight today. Our second theme in this year's AO is anchored by a robust competition, and in some respects, a symbiotic relationship between renewable electricity sources and natural gas. The cost of producing electricity from these two energy sources has declined significantly over the last decade plus, and there are reasons to believe these trends will continue. Several of the AO cases are designed specifically to quantify the uncertainty in this competition between energy sources to supply electricity. What is less uncertain in this competitive market is how other power generation sources struggle to maintain their market share. So what this slide is showing is the growth rate of US electricity use on the left and use by end-use sector of electricity, both on-site generation and purchased electricity, which you can see on the right. Net electricity generation in the reference case grows by about a third from 2020 to 2050, while capacity increases by roughly 2/3. So the disparity in these two growth levels, again, one growing by a third for generation and 2/3 for capacity, is in large part due to the intermittent nature of wind and solar generation, which means that other resources, including storage, are needed to meet demand at night or during low wind periods. This is why capacity grows by even more in the low renewables cost case, despite generation being about the same, which we're going to see on the next slide. Although it may seem that demand grows slowly by roughly 1% per year over the projection, this is significantly faster than the past decade, which experienced basically zero growth. Some of the new demand is taken up by on-site generation, which makes it harder to change the remaining generation mix in the US because new plants are competing against existing ones rather than meeting new demand. EIA expects COVID-19's projected impacts on the electricity demand are in the short term. One other thing I wanted to draw your attention to on this slide, on the right-hand graph, under current laws, policy and economic assumptions, growth in transportation's use of electricity remains relatively small compared to the other sectors. So there's a lot to kind of unpack on this slide. So I'm going to try to walk us through some of the nuances here. So what this slide is showing is cumulative generating capacity additions and retirements in select cases from 2021 to 2050. In 2020, the US electricity generating capacity was just over 1,150 gigawatts. Between 2020 and 2050, capacity roughly increases by 50 to 84%, depending on the AO case. Virtually all of this growth is coming from solar, wind, and natural gas. Renewable electric generating technologies account for almost 60% of the approximately 1,000 gigawatts of cumulative capacity additions projected in our reference case this year, so from 2020 to 2050. So this is most significantly a result of declining capital costs, but also a result of increasing renewable portfolio standard targets, as well as tax credits. Although wind contributes to renewable electric generating capacity additions, it is on a much smaller scale compared with solar capacity additions, which build steadily throughout the projection period. Wind additions are largely tied to policy. Production tax credit, or PTC, for wind is now assumed within our AO to run through 2024, following a one-year extension. And although capital costs for both wind and solar continue to decline throughout the projection period, without additional policy intervention, wind is not as cost competitive as solar. More than 2/3 of the cumulative wind capacity additions from 2020 to 2050 occur before the PTC expires at the end of 2024. So the steadier pace of solar additions in part reflects the continued availability of an investment tax credit, or ITC. EIA assumes solar receives a 30% ITC through 2023, which is then reduced to a permanent value of 10% in 2024 onward. Natural gas continues to be the fuel of choice for fossil fuel capacity additions. So as I mentioned, renewable electric generating technologies account for 60% of the cumulative capacity additions in the reference case. The remaining balance is largely made up of natural gas-fired generators, roughly 40% through 2050. These natural gas-fired generator additions are almost evenly split between combined cycle technologies as well as combustion turbines, which both provide energy and help balance the intermittent output from wind and solar generators. Looking at retirements, most of the coal-fired generating retirements shown in black on this graph assumed in the AAO reference case occur by 2025. So the reference case includes legislation and regulation as of September 2020. And so it incorporated EPA's Affordable Clean Energy Rule, the ACE rule. And the ACE rule was recently vacated a couple weeks ago in the DC Circuit Court. However, in AAO 2021, EIA assumes that coal-fired plants must either invest in heat rate, that is efficiency improvement technologies, by 2025, or retire to comply with ACE. The coal-fired plants remaining after ACE was scheduled to take effect are more efficient and continue to operate throughout the projection period. Low natural gas prices in the early years of the projection also contribute to the retirements of coal-fired and nuclear capacity. So what this graph is looking at is electric generation by fuel across 3 cases, and it highlights why natural gas prices matter. So in the reference case shown on the far left, the share of natural gas in the generation mix remains flat, hovering at about 1/3 from 2020 to 2050. The share remains stable though natural gas prices remain low. They're at or below $3.50 per MMBTU through the early 2030s before rising through the end of the projection period. As I said, gas prices matter, and you can see this in the middle graph, which shows our low oil and gas supply case, which has much higher natural gas prices. In this case, you can see that natural gas generation falls and renewables is significantly higher. This is in contrast to the high oil and gas supply case, shown on the far right, which has much lower natural gas prices and much higher natural gas generation and less renewables. So in the absence of policy, the market is very much price and cost driven. And as you can see here, there's potential for a lot of variation. So that takes us to our last highlight we're sharing today. And this is about our domestic production and how it relates to the US connection to global energy markets and how that varies across cases. And I'm going to start with looking at natural gas. So the chart on the left displays US dry natural gas production across cases. And the chart on the right is our projection for LNG exports. So domestic natural gas production in the reference case returns to pre-COVID levels starting in 2023. In the long term, production continues to grow during the entire projection period. This is driven by end-use consumption and opportunities to sell natural gas internationally through LNG exports primarily. In the high oil and gas supply side case, more resources and more availability results in increased domestic production and higher levels of both LNG and net exports. The high oil price case shows similar results with high production levels and accompanying exports. So what this slide is showing is natural gas consumption and net exports in 2020 and 2050 in the reference and supply cases. In the reference case, increase in consumption between 2020 and 2050 primarily comes from 2 areas, and this is increased natural gas demand from the industrial sector, which grows by 3.6 TCF, and in net exports, which grows by 4.7 TCF. In the reference case during this time period, growth in electric power, transportation, and commercial natural gas consumption is about 0.4 TCF each. However, growth patterns, particularly for electricity, use of natural gas, as well as net exports change most dramatically depending on how the price of natural gas evolves over the long term. So high gas supply, which results in low gas prices, results in significant gas consumption for electric power generation, as well as net exports. So moving on to liquids, this slide shows crude oil and natural gas liquids production across several cases on the left, as well as net exports on the right. So reference case crude oil production remains at record high levels for the next 30 years. Domestic crude oil and natural gas plant liquids production in the reference case returns to pre-COVID levels in 2023. In the long term, production continues to grow stabilizing in the later years of the projection period. The Brent crude oil price returns to 2019 levels near the end of this decade in the reference case. If oil prices are higher than the reference case or supply is higher because of larger and cheaper wells, then crude oil production returns to 2019 levels much more quickly. However, in the low oil price case, where oil prices are much lower than recent historical levels seen in the last 10 years, production never returns to pre-COVID-19 levels. Tight oil is a primary driver of growth in our oil production outlook. This is led by the Wolfcamp play in the Permian Basin in the Southwest region, as well as the Bakken play in the Williston Basin in the Northern Great Plains region, which leads to growth in U.S. tight oil production across our projections. However, estimates of technically recoverable tight or shale crude oil and natural gas resources are uncertain. And so I encourage everyone to look at our high and low oil and gas supply cases to explore the impact of higher and lower resource supply levels. In the reference case, the United States is both an importer and an exporter of petroleum liquids, importing mostly heavy crude and exporting mostly petroleum products such as gasoline and diesel. Net exports of petroleum and other liquids hold steady in the reference case and stay in a similar range for the rest of the projection period. The side cases illustrate the variable nature of the United States petroleum trade depending on what assumptions are made. In the high oil and gas supply side case, again, more resources, more availability result in increased domestic production and higher levels of net exports. The high oil price case shows similar results. However, the opposite occurs in the low oil and gas supply and low oil price side cases, where, as you can see on the graph on the right, the US remains a net importer throughout the projection. So with that, I will take you back to our three highlights. There's also, as Steve mentioned, a lot of other interesting findings and materials that will be published on our website following this event related to the AEO. So I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you again to the Bipartisan Policy Center. And more importantly, thank you to the EIA team that worked really hard on putting this analysis together. And I will turn this back to you, Sasha. Thank you.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Steve and Angelina, for the overview and the tour of that work. There's a lot there to kind of think through and unpack, as you said. And we're fortunate to have a few of your colleagues here with us to help us navigate some of the implications of the work. Let me just go ahead and introduce them now as we dive into the discussion part of this program. We have three senior folks from EIA with us. John Staub, who is a senior advisor for energy analysis. Jim Diefendorfer, who is the director of the Office of Long-Term Energy Modeling. And Jim Turner, who's a senior advisor for energy analysis. They're all long-time veterans of EIA and of energy analysis, and they're going to help us kind of think through what we've learned here from the AEO. Let me just also remind everybody that if you have a question, you can pose that. You can pose it on Facebook, on YouTube, or via Twitter. And let's just dive into the conversation here. First of all, I don't envy any of you in trying to figure out where the energy sector is going with all the complexity that we've seen over the last year and all the policy turmoil that we see in front of us. Maybe just start off at a high level. If I see the core results here as we look ahead, one of the things that really sticks out is that we're still burning and utilizing an enormous amount of fossil fuels even in 2050. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about why that's the case and what assumptions you have in the model that drive that outcome, because I'm sure many of our listeners are sort of wondering how that fits with the world that we see ourselves moving towards.
Well, I can take an overview of that, but it gets down into some sectoral questions that Jim and John might want to also address. Angelina had a slide that showed the fuel consumptions by sector, and there's different trajectories, and then there's fuels within the sectors that have their own growth or decline. The shape overall in the fossil fuel mix has to do with both petroleum and natural gas. Coal use, as you saw, declines and continues a fairly rapid decline, but then levels off to a slow decline later in the projection period. That's in the electric sector, if Jim wants to talk about that. As you saw, motor gasoline is the predominant use for petroleum, and that follows a sort of slow decline and then increase as the effect of fuel economy standards tapers off and is met by increased travel demand toward the end of the projection period. In the meantime, industrial natural gas use, as Angelina pointed out, increases at a fairly robust clip throughout the projection. And then there's the competition between renewables and natural gas in the electric power sector, which is where there's probably the most uncertainty that's not related to policy, but is rather related to markets. So the combination of the mostly petroleum and natural gas results in the continuation of fossil fuel use in the United States energy sector.
Just, we don't have any breakthrough technology advances in batteries for transportation, which would be a key thing that would reduce the use of petroleum products in the transportation sector. Petroleum products are a very energy dense energy carrier, and that makes it very valuable to transportation and hard to displace or hard to replace.
And as Jim mentioned, of course, with the decline in coal, as was demonstrated by the slide from Angelina, coal use declines from roughly a 19% share in the 2020 timeframe to about an 11% share by 2050. And of course, natural gas, while it does increase, is still maintaining its roughly 1/3 share through the projection, as Angelina highlighted in her presentation. And natural gas is used for generation to help complement some of the generation from the wind and solar technologies.
Yeah, thanks. One of the other things that seems to really be driving this sort of reference case analysis is the pandemic itself. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about your assessment that it's going to take a really long time to return to 2019 levels of U.S. energy consumption. What's behind that? And how did you think about a return to employment and the revival of the U.S. economy?
I'll give a response to that. We at the Energy Information Administration do not develop independent macroeconomic assessments. We work with external vendors on that, primarily IHS Markit, and that macroeconomic assessment comes in several times a year, and that had been affected heavily by the events of the past year. By the time we were ready to produce the annual energy outlook reference case, we were operating from an August macroeconomic input level that was then projected out. I would like to note that, as Acting Administrator Nally pointed out, we produced a report on trends and expectations for the annual energy outlook, which mostly focused on the pandemic response and how that affected the short, mid, and long-term energy markets. It's not just a report. There is also on our website a series of webinars, which include over a dozen external speakers and external presentations to get at some of these sources of uncertainty. So while we understand that there is considerable uncertainty around, for instance, telecommuting, the return to work, the return to school, how that might in fact reinforce longer term trends that were already starting to occur. We really are, in this report, the annual energy outlook that we're releasing today, providing people with kind of a reference point for further analysis. And the macroeconomic trends in terms of returning to consumption levels, while it does take time, in general, the system is quite resilient to what's occurred in the past year.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I think that's a really important starting point for all of this. I'm going to shift to a question from the audience, which is focused on electric vehicles. And it goes, is there an AEO scenario that accounts for the rapid electric vehicle adoption in the 2020s in light of the recent GM announcement?
Sorry, I guess I'll take that again. We work with existing laws and regulation. It's very important for people to understand that while the modeling we use has a lot of detail in it, and that's on purpose so we can address things like vehicle stocks, things like electric vehicle penetration and sales, right down to regional policies and even state policies at times. We don't make speculation about policy, and we tend to not make speculations about market moves off of existing trends. We do that with scenarios and case studies where warranted. And in this instance, this package of annual energy outlook scenarios is mainly designed to produce pretty wide-ranging, broad spectrum assumption changes, so people have a framework within which to make further analysis. So while you may see some changes in electric vehicle cost and performance over time, they continue to improve. They do continue to modestly penetrate the market. We do not have a step change, as John Staub just mentioned. We don't deliberately model historical breakthroughs, and we don't tend to model particular entities making announcements or decisions in the market. So we'll wait and see how the data comes in. Many of the announcements that are ongoing, both on a policy and a corporate level, have fairly long timeframes. And we're with the reference case here, we're effectively casting a baseline against which further changes in policy and regulation and markets should be evaluated.
Thanks, Jim. One of the real tensions that I see in this work, and that we also see in the work we do at the BPC, is the competition between natural gas and renewables in the power sector. And we have a question here from Charles from Natural Gas World, who is wondering about the renewable energy penetration projections that you have, and is observing that they're mostly in the power sector and not other sectors. And he'd like you to say a little bit more about that.
I think our projections, I believe the slide that Angelina highlighted was power sector, but we are also showing a fair amount of renewable penetration on the end use side, and I think she did show one that showed some increasing end use generation. But I guess we do have roughly, I guess by the end of the projection period, by 2050, the solar penetration within the renewable sector itself is approaching 50% for all of the renewable energy generation.
Okay, thanks. And then, following up on that, we'll stick with the theme of the power sector. We have a question here from David, who is wondering what your assumptions are for the continued utilization of coal going forward. Do you assume in the out years that it needs to have CCS to continue operating?
We do model generating technologies that incorporate CCS, but the AEO 2021 with the current laws and regulations doesn't require that new coal units. Well, I'm sorry. I guess the bottom line is we don't build any new coal units as part of.
I think that was the question. Are you seeing any CCS deployed in the reference case?
Typically, no. I guess sometimes not in the reference case, no. In some of the other cases, we may see some natural gas fired combined cycle units with CCS, but that tends to be more of a regional focus. But we're not experiencing any new coal plant additions.
And when you look at the power sector trends going forward, there wasn't much discussion of nuclear energy. Can you say a bit about how the existing fleet performs in the years ahead, in this outlook, and what happens with relicensing of those reactors?
Sure. I guess in 2020 the generation from nuclear is roughly 20%, a shade under 20%. And I guess by 2050 in the reference case, we're seeing that decline more to around 10% or so. If economic, we do assume that the continued licensing of these plants, that the plants that are currently in existence will achieve subsequent license renewals. However, that we do see, as Angelina highlighted on one of her slides, we do see a number of nuclear retirements, and they are retiring based on economics. I might point out that we also do include some of the state level programs for the zero emission credits, which serve to supplement some of the nuclear plants for some period of time through the projection.
Thanks, Jim. Now we have a question from Jerry Gechter, who is wondering about the particular industries that are driving the large increases in industrial usage of natural gas and LPGs. Can you say a little bit more about that?
So that's primarily in the petrochemical industries and industries that can take advantage of the relatively low cost hydrocarbon gas liquids as well as natural gas. Jim, were there any other specifics that I recall?
Well, the other one that comes up a lot is bulk chemicals, because there's been some increase in the competitiveness of the bulk chemical industry vis-a-vis exports and imports over time as natural gas prices have gone down. And keep in mind, not all of that is burned or combusted or transformed into, plastics. It's used for fertilizer. It's called feedstocks. So it undergoes a transformation and goes back out as nitrate fertilizers and so forth.
Now, some of our markets for energy products are not domestic, as we know, they are global, petroleum in particular. And I'm wondering how you factor in sort of the international trends and some of the external forces that are going on around the world, in particular, what's happening with OPEC Plus and their supply constraints, and how you factor that into your analysis in terms of what will happen here in terms of oil and gas production, oil in particular.
So we have a variety of approaches and models that we use for oil price modeling and oil production. In the AEO, we use supply curves to represent the trade aspect of both the crude oil and the refined products coming in and out of the U.S., both on the West Coast, Gulf Coast, and East Coast. The key factors to think about are what are other countries willing to sell their crude oil into the global market? And so we keep track of resources in a very detailed sense across the globe and long term. And from our analysis and work with other organizations, there's a lot of oil globally. Over time, those prices do rise in real terms as cheaper resources are developed first. But as we've talked about today, the prices by 2050 in the reference case are $95 per barrel Brent. Obviously, that could be higher depending upon kind of geopolitical conditions in the long term, but it also could be lower. So those are kind of the key things to think about in terms of the prices. In the near term, the actions of OPEC Plus, they are actively adjusting production. As we saw recently, OPEC or Saudi Arabia announcing a further 1 million barrel a day cut, and that has contributed to oil prices rising to the highest level in the past year. So there's definitely a lot of activity going on in terms of as demand comes back from the impact of the response to shutdown of travel, but then also producers. In the U.S., producers are very price responsive, and so that is, they are one of the key players in the market, balancing the market. Obviously, it doesn't balance exactly in a moment, but it balances relatively quickly.
Maybe just to build on that a bit, I know that your group released the International Energy Outlook in October of last year. And I'm wondering, what has changed in your view, or what might be some interesting insights between now and your analysis in the fall that our audience might be interested in hearing about.
Are you thinking about oil or electricity, or?
Yeah, I was thinking about oil, and just to build on the previous question.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the questions that comes up perennially after these shocks in the market is, if prices fall, that makes it much less attractive to large producers to invest in very expensive projects. Many of the projects, whether they're offshore or just the economies of scale that are required for other projects, it's expensive. And so it ends up causing delays in that investment. And so there are often concerns that, well, we're going to see a kind of a bounce back 2-3 years down the road because there wasn't enough investment made following the price shock. That sometimes occurs, but it's not a guarantee. And so there's definitely it's a balancing act. The market is more resilient than many, I think, are willing to acknowledge. The refinery sector is very efficient in allocating crudes to the facilities that can process it into the grades of petroleum products that are required. So, currently jet fuel is quite low. There's very low demand for jet fuel, and so what would have been converted into jet fuel is now being used for distillates for trucking and shipping, etc. So in our IEO coming up, the past one was mostly focused on electricity. The next one will be more all-encompassing, and as I mentioned earlier, we do look at very detailed resources globally and incorporate that into how we see the competition between fuels, as well as technologies, and how people demand. Are they demanding electricity for vehicles in different parts of the world, and what is the impact of that on demand for petro products?
So we're getting lots of questions on sort of how technologies might emerge and evolve going forward. And I know that that's not really necessarily what you're focused on here with the EIA, which is just sort of a reference case without any new policies coming into play. But we have a question here from Daniel Klein, who was wondering, does hydrogen emerge on its own as a significant part of the energy system in this EIA?
So we do model. There is some hydrogen that's modeled. Hydrogen is an important component in the refinery sector. Using natural gas, stripping hydrogen from that for processing, for removing coking products. But it's within the modeling that we have at this point, the economics don't lead to a real shift towards hydrogen.
We'll also note that there are fuel cells that are in the model, both in buildings applications and in transportation applications. I think we're seeing some new talking and development in the hydrogen markets. We're obviously aware of that and paying attention to it. We're looking for evidence and anecdotes, facts, case studies to see what new applications might come about. And for us, what it always comes down to is what are the cost and performance parameters of anything like that does come along.
I guess I might also point out that we do model fuel cells as a technology as part of our generating unit mix as well. But typically, again, it comes down to cost and performance characteristics as to whether those get adopted. I guess from a data collection standpoint, I guess we do collect information on plants that are electric generating plants that are planned for installation, and what we've started to learn that some of the newer plants, the gas-fired combined cycle plants, are being spec'd out to burn some percentage of hydrogen. But I think those plants, the installations of those plants are a few years out right now.
When we are approaching the end of the hour here, I'll just encourage folks, if you have any final questions, please send them to us as quickly as you can. I would just maybe ask the three of you to reflect on what you see as the most important kind of structural trends in the in the energy system right now, and as we think about marrying those trends against some of the policy forces that are being discussed today, what should we keep in mind? And in terms of the trajectory of renewables, and how what are some of the key questions that we face, particularly in the power sector right now as we look at decarbonization?
Well, I think some of the key areas would just be the continued development of the renewables, and I guess we are modeling. I guess we didn't really specifically mention this, but we are modeling energy storage as part of the our power sector options. We model both a standalone battery system as well as a hybrid configuration, a PV plant that also incorporates storage. So I think we'll be looking to learn more about the development of those particular technologies as we move forward, as well as like the prior question alluded to the hydrogen, as well as technologies that might be able to take advantage of hydrogen going forward.
I guess I would just offer the note that it in the past it was pretty rare for new technology to make a major impact in energy markets. Petroleum, departed almost entirely from electric power. Wind came in, natural gas combined cycle turbines. For many, many years, other than shale gas and the decrease in production cost, those kinds of handful of factors were what you had from a technology standpoint, leaving aside policy. Now we've recently seen a few more. We've seen rooftop solar. We had to change the modeling for rooftop solar to catch up with what was happening. The story about light bulbs, LEDs versus CFLs versus incandescents, those came in different ways than we'd seen before, a little bit surprising. So for my part, I just think that's an interesting note, having been around the sector for a long time. There have been some changes in just technological terms that have been a little bit quicker than we've seen previously.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to have to stop it there. Let me just say to our speaker today, Steve and Angelina, and our panelists, thank you for sharing this work with us, and for all the work that you do at EIA. We're all very appreciative of that. And thanks to our audience for spending this last hour with us today. We look forward to working together in the months ahead. Stay safe. Thanks, everybody.